sharing my screen, and let's get to the beginning. Previous, I need. Right, yes, and I put down, there are a lot of collaborators, but Dr. Farouk Naeem perhaps kicked off this particular project, and my lead investigator is Dr. Peter Firry, and we're part of a team that has been exploring cultural adaptation of CBT for quite a while. So with the success of cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, in the global north, it was natural to spread it to other places, but that came up against certain problems. It did not translate as well into other cultures for reasons that I'll follow shortly, leading to the whole adaptation enterprise, which again has been quite successful. Recent meta-analyses with lots of studies published by Rathod et al. And Degnan et al. In 2018, for instance, show good results. So our study is right at a very early stage. It's a pilot to develop and evaluate a manual to introduce the novel approach of comprehend, cope, and connect to cultural adaptation. And I come from the as I've said, there's myself, there's Lydia who did most of the therapies, and various other people. Shana Rathod is important in this group, and other people who have helped us. The paper is not yet submitted, so I will not be presenting the detailed results, and but there is a chapter, a book chapter that is published, and I'll be reporting material out of that towards the end. So to go back to the UK scene, we've got a very multicultural population, particularly in the cities, and we have a national program to introduce talking therapies for common mental health presentations called IAPT, increasing access to psychological therapies, but this is not taken up as widely by people from our ethnic minorities as the host population. And the serious result, I think, is that more people from ethnic minorities fetch up with severe mental illness at the acute phase, which is extremely regrettable. And also there's questions about how acceptable our standard approaches are because of high dropout rates from diverse populations. The specific criticisms that the whole cultural adaptation enterprise has picked up about translating global Northwestern therapies to other cultures are as follows. Other cultures very often view mental health in a completely different way. The diagnostically based illness model makes a lot less sense to them, as probably to our previous speaker and indeed to myself. Spirituality and faith are seen as important in this area. The person's relationship to the divine, to the wider context, has somehow got disturbed in case of mental health challenge. Also, emotions aren't seen necessarily in the same way. In the West, we're constantly talking about our emotions and our feelings and what have you. In other cultures, sometimes it's much more seen in somatic terms, because after all, things like anxiety are picked up by the body. Makes perfect sense. And there's been criticism of the very individual bias of Western culture, which translates into our standard therapies. Other ethnicities see people much more embedded in their family and their collective, and this is not well captured in the standard therapies. Also, there's a need for an adaptation for diverse groups in a multicultural society. I've referred to the successful, the good results that cultural adaptations of CBT, for instance, have produced, but most of those have been targeted at particular groups. Farooq Naeem, for instance, has done a lot of work with South Asian cultures within the UK and with people in Pakistan. A lot of the US studies are targeting Spanish American groups or Chinese, for instance. We needed something that was going to work for everybody. So, I'll just say a word more about our study. How it came about was that Farooq Naeem, somebody I'd collaborated with on something else in the past, came up to me and said, the next phase needs to pick up the use of mindfulness, which is very much used in third wave cognitive behavior therapy studies. So we actually worked together for quite a while over the internet. He works in Canada, but has strong links and was also working in Pakistan. I, of course, was in the UK. And together we developed the beginning of the manual. But then it was picked up by the department in Southampton, led by Peter Firry, and my approach, which is Comprehend, Cope and Connect, was used for this manual. So I'm going to explain that this is an approach that understands mental health challenge in a very universal way. Starts off from the idea that our brains are wired up into two distinct sort of circuits. I base this, the theoretical basis that I use for this is the cognitive architecture model interacting cognitive subsystems. I'm not going to say anything about this now. I have published extensively on it elsewhere. The emotional part of the brain, it has direct connections to the senses and to the body state system, the arousal system. It's looking out for what's important for us. It's looking out for who we are. It manages relationship. The other bit, which is evolutionarily newer, is the verbal part that can make fine distinctions. And the important part about this is that these two work together at what dialectical behavior therapy, from which I've borrowed this diagram, calls wise mind. And when they're working together at a sort of calm level of arousal, but at high and at low arousal, they separate out. And for mental health, what is particularly significant is the fact that the memory is modular. So there is an emotional memory and there is a verbal memory there. And so when these two separate out at high and at low arousal, and we lose that wise mind, we also lose time and place. So where the emotions have taken over, somebody is under threat, they are not only dealing with what they're dealing with now, but also times when they were under threat in the past. And this is one of the factors that makes being human really difficult, because then things are bad, they suddenly become 10 times worse. And this is an easy way to explain to people PTSD type symptoms, or why they find a particular anniversary, Christmas is a favorite, particularly difficult, and that sort of thing, why they have a break, why now for the breakdown. So how Comprehend, Cope and Connect meets the challenges. It starts from felt sense, from that, what does it feel like to be me now? which is quite calm when everything is straightforward, but picks up very quickly when the person is under threat. It has a universally applicable explanation for the role of trauma, a normalizing explanation for distress and difficulties in functioning with mental breakdown, because it looks at mental breakdown as ways that people cope with an intolerable internal state, which we've seen it's quite easy to achieve. These ways make sense in the short term, they really help, but if the person carries on doing the same thing, they've got problems. For instance, if things are just too much, they withdraw, they go to bed, they don't get up, they keep on crying, they get a diagnosis of depression. If they're worrying takes over and it's anxiety and so on. The solution is therefore to, first of all, demonstrate, comprehend that that's what's going on to the person so that they can see that they need to cope in a different way. And mindfulness, which brings together those two circles, stops them from drifting off, is the central intervention, but a whole lot of others follow from that. And another way in which this intervention is rather suitable for cultural adaptation is that it gets away from the sort of preciousness of therapy being one-to-one. You want it to be explicit. It was developed in acute services. It was developed for work with teams. You want everyone to understand the comprehend bit. You want everyone to support the person coping differently. So bringing in the family, bringing in other people, if that's what the person wants, which is more acceptable for a lot of cultures, fits perfectly with this approach. I've lost a line there. Consideration of, yes, spirituality and faith are integral to CCC, as I'll explain in a minute, and this allows for that dimension, which is more important cross-culturally. So this is the simple diagram we use for the formulation. It all starts with the horrible feeling, what the person feels like inside. Something or other happened recently. Something or other happened recently to sort of spark this off. Why does it keep doing that? And that brings down stuff from the past, making for the intolerable internal state. You then stop all that and get a long list of the person's strengths, all their sound relationships, everything they really care about, what they're good about, they're passionate about, and their wider faith, their spiritual connection, what is important to them on the spiritual sphere, which becomes particularly important when these other relationships around have sort of fallen away, as so often happens in breakdown. So then you do the maintaining cycle, which is exactly the same as CBT. It's a behavioral analysis. What they're feeling dreadful, they do something, it works in the short term. They tell you how actually it then goes wrong and keeps them stuck. So that's the formulation. So the brief individual therapy, as I say, it's used in a lot of different settings. It's used very successfully in teams, but in individual therapy, you start with 4 formulation sessions. You listen carefully, and then you work out what's going on with that person with using their words and simple language, bring in other people if they want it. This demonstrates what needs to change. You then use that to negotiate goals to work on, and these arise naturally from that diagram. This is then supported over another 4 to 8 sessions with a 3-month follow-up appointment. That's how we did it with the individual therapies that we delivered, 32 therapies in our pilot study. It's delivered differently in the IAP service, where I first developed it for primary care. and where it's linked with a group program. It's actually much longer because we there target a more difficult population. But here we just took anybody who came into the service and a couple of other services from an ethnically diverse background to get our sample within the time frame. Partners and other family members can be included. So this is about our project. The original manual was developed over the internet between myself and Farouk, and he was using it but in Canada and that sort of thing. It's transdiagnostic, it actually ignores diagnosis. We had in teaching stories, we incorporated spirituality and faith. It's built around mindfulness and it's open to a somatic interpretation. The horrible feeling can be a horrible sensation. Doesn't matter what it is, you name whatever the person brings that's causing them to do whatever it is that's causing things not to work well for them. I supervised the 32 cases. They were mostly done by Lydia Baxter, who's a great therapist, but there were a couple of other therapists involved as well. We, in those supervision sessions, various other culturally important things came up, which we incorporated into the manual. For instance, there was an interesting conflict sometimes between the fact that the person in their context, in their cultural context, in their family, they had a duty to look after everybody. And in the cases where people had mental health challenges, this could be being just too much pressure. This could be dragging down their mental health. But as soon as they got diagnosed, as soon as people recognized that they had an illness, all of a sudden, everybody else had a duty to look after them. So that was quite an interesting one that we worked with, a sort of balancing act. It was also interesting where you've got people who have migrated into a host culture, where you've got second and third generations, sometimes the people we're working with, very interesting intergenerational things where the older generations were much more steeped in the original culture and the younger generations had adopted the new one. Faith issues did come up, they were important. And because CCC it's got a way of talking about faith as experience of relationship. And this enabled us to work with situations where people felt that their faith was forcing them into guilt and feeling punished and that kind of thing. To look at the quality of the relationship and the possibility of that relationship could be different. And the universality of compassion in the major faiths was an ally for us there. So the study, 32 participants from local mental health services, mainly increasing access to psychological therapies. The wide variety of ethnicities, this really was culture-free. Caribbean, African, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Turkish, Chinese, mixed and lots of people from mixed ethnicities. We only offered between 8 and 12 sessions, which is briefer than standard CCC. We used the following measures, fairly usual ones. I'm not going to say a lot about that because it's hopefully the paper will be out soon, but we mustn't spread this out until it's properly done. And again, the results, I'm going to be vague. They were good, basically. But a couple of things were really important. One is acceptability, this dropout rate thing. We did not have it. We had 91% retention, which is actually an awful lot better than the norm. And yeah, that's really encouraging. Now, what I can report is the trauma data, and this is really interesting because this is reported in the published chapter, so that's okay. The diagnoses were mostly depression and anxiety, apart from a couple of PTSDs and a few odd ods. They were picked up from routine referrals accepted simply on the basis of diverse ethnicity. They weren't selected for trauma. But identifying the impact of past trauma or past adverse experience on current functioning without exploring it is an important element in the therapy. So what we found was all our 30 of our 32 participants could report significant trauma or adversity in the past. The two that didn't, one had an autistic diagnosis and so will have had difficulties in developmental times, and the other one had migration during the developmental period. And many of the others reported really significant trauma, childhood abuse, rape, domestic violence, and this was just a very normal sample given a short therapy. So that's our study, and publications, key publications. I'll say the main one hasn't come out yet. I hope it soon will do. I've said that this approach, Comprehend, Cope and Connect, has most of the evaluation, the study has been done in acute services. It works very well in teams. It translates well into getting a whole team to think and operate psychologically. And so we've got publications, evaluations from the acute services. This is the book chapter, which actually was very much focused on trauma. So that what I've reported there about the trauma effects came out of that. Then there are two books. I'm just going to put my light on. It's getting, so evening is coming on in the UK. These two books, this one has got a manual in it, and this one came out in September and is written for a more general population, is a good easy read. You can find out all this stuff. I mean, I hope I can circulate the slides, but I have a website, and you can get hold of me by email through the contact thing on my website, which is simply myname.org. So I think that's me.